happened has been such an immense human tragedy. And every day that it continues, it delivers more of the same in terms of misery. Uh, it's a complicated question. On one level, Gorbachev was of the view that Crimea was Russian. He thought the Donbass was Russian. And at the same time, I think he would not have countenanced an invasion like this at all. And the question is such a messy one regarding Ukraine, and I'll make no friends talking about it, of course. But when the Soviet Union was dissolving, it wasn't done in an entirely orderly fashion, and these things never are. I mean, what's remarkable about it was just how little bloodshed there was with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But there were some negotiations that were occurring between the now Russian Republic and the Soviet Ukrainian Republic, especially as Yeltsin had asserted his power over who gets what. And the Russian leadership was, mostly of the view that, oh, come on, guys, don't be serious. Don't think you're going to have the Donbass and Ukraine here. And of course, and rather Crimea. And the Ukrainians were of the view that, no, these were areas that were historically populated by Ukrainian speakers, at least, with maybe the exception of Crimea. But even in the Donbass, the Donbass, of course, as it industrializes with French capital in the late 19th century, then all of a sudden, of course, you have all these ethnic Russian speakers that move into the area. But the rural areas, still Ukrainian speaking. But of course, then we have this Vichy-like Ukrainian regime, which is created by the Germans after World War I, and of course that includes Crimea and the Donbass, and it's even a little bit bigger in terms of territories to the east. So it's not surprising that the Ukrainians want that. But if I could make just one other point, there's also the issue of populism here, and it's terrible how the term is always used pejoratively. I'm going to do that myself here right now. As the Soviet Union was falling apart and as Gorbachev was making his last gasp attempts at keeping it together as kind of an economic union, what Yeltsin was able to do was to go to the Ukraine and say, hey, you want your freedom and your liberty, and the same thing in Russia. How was he able to do that? He went to workers. And the argument that both Ukrainian and Russian nationalists made with their working class was to say in Ukraine, hey, imagine how rich we would be if we just got rid of these Russians. We've got this industrial area in the Donbass, and we've got this black earth belt that is agriculturally the most productive in the world. Imagine if we could just untether ourselves from this Soviet Union thing. We'll be massively rich. And then the Russians, of course. And Yeltsin really believed this stuff. Imagine how rich we're going to be once we cut ourselves off from all these other republics who we're supporting out of our budget. We have, with all of them, with the exception of one in Central Asia, a massive, imbalance in which we're sending them way more money than we're getting back from them. So there was a simple idea that you just untether and then you're fine. But I think getting back to your important question, Gorbachev would have been horrified by this war. At the same time, he as the 21st century unfolded, he was also very unhappy with the United States and how he thought that the United States increasingly took advantage of Russia.
Well, and that's where Gorbachev's naivete is unforgivable, right? The part of Gorbachev, or at least for me, that's truly unforgivable, I think, is in his lack of recognition of the nature of Western imperialism. I don't think he fully grasped what the United States was as an imperial entity. He understood the United States in a Cold War context. Mm-hmm. He understood them as a rival superpower, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think he understood what imperialism would be and would become as its rival unraveled. And I think
this is where you're absolutely right. And this is where his vanity got in the way, because they flattered him endlessly, the Americans and the Germans, and he actually had an interesting example. I mean, I'm appalled by everything Ronald Reagan represented, but the one damn thing that Reagan did right was to ignore his national intelligence and defense establishment and proceed with these negotiations with Gorbachev. They were all thoroughly against it. People like the Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, was storming around, having fits, threatening to resign. They were all saying that, look, the Soviets are just trying to lull you into this false sense of security. They're going to get you to denuclearize, and then they're going to attack you. Uh, I think I think from the perspective of the time, Gorbachev was taken in by what he thought was the possibility of agency actually existing. Here is this US president that is actually operating against his entire national defense and intelligence apparatus and taking the country in a direction that, in principle, it should not be able to be taken if you just had a purely kind of structuralist view of the way countries operate. So yeah, but yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right. I mean, he got blinded by the flattery, and when he had nothing left to bargain with in terms of chips, uh, yeah, then it was like, oh, Gorby, wonderful guy. Boy, I wish we could help you out, but we can't. you know.
Well, and that ultimately, I think, is part of the complex legacy that he leaves behind, right? Because on the one hand, it's like, he made good faith efforts, right? He really made good faith attempts to reform the system within the Soviet Union, to basically try to end the Cold War, or at the very least sort of wind it down from what it had been, whether it's nuclear treaties or anti ballistic missile treaties or whatever. I mean, these things were extremely important, and Gorbachev does get credit for those things. And at the same time, it's very interesting that he just seems to have not understood imperialism in this sense, that imperialism is a system and that it doesn't care what you do or what deal you make with the person who may or may not be at the head at a given moment, that imperialism rolls on. And so I guess, to me, that's where this whole argument about, well, Putin launched the war because NATO expanded eastward, is totally ludicrous, right? The idea that NATO expanded eastward, yeah, that's what empires do. They are imperialist, and that's how they operate. So again, coming back to Ukraine now, Putin doesn't get to justify a genocidal war of this kind, that where he seeks to erase Ukraine, which, by the way, he launched this war with a stridently anti-Lenin, anti-communist,
Oh,
anti-Bolshevik
I,
speech,
I remember well. Yeah,
the most anti-communist speech I think I've ever heard.
right.
And in a sense, it's predicated on this idea that, well, NATO's expansion forced us into this. But yet, if you look at the actual history of 30 years, of the last 30 years, maybe you could say some naivete on the part of the Soviets. But beyond that, imperialism's doing what imperialism does.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, we know it's. I mean, there's that imperialism, and of course, there's the desire of all of these newly independent countries on the border of Russia to have security. So I mean, that stuff can't be just entirely dismissed. I mean, there are too many people that I know that had their relatives sent off in uh, cattle cars in the in the middle of the winter to Siberia, just dropped off and told go fend for yourself. So people remember that kind of stuff, and so they not that this justifies NATO expansion in the way that it has expanded, and in what NATO is, because it's essentially the arm of the United States. We all know that, but yeah, nonetheless, these are real issues. They're complex, and they need to be understood. And I would agree with you. Again, knowing that Russia was just endlessly antagonized by the Americans, and but nonetheless, that does not justify this war.
Well, Jeff, I was so engaged by our conversation that I forgot to take a break in the middle of it. So I guess people are going to listen to unadulterated 70 minutes of us talking. But final question, Jeff, for you.
A stock of a night shock work.
So, final question, Jeff. Tell us about Gorbachev's legacy as you see it. We already talked about that a little bit, but as both a political economist, but something of a historian yourself, how do we write the hagiography, of Gorbachev? How do we tell the story of Gorbachev and capture some of the nuances of the historical moment in which he was prominent?
Yeah, another great question. That he was, as you say, a well-intentioned leader. That he was thoughtful. He was smart. He was engaged. Because of his vanity, he had significant blind spots, and he presided over a system that unraveled at the ultimate cost of millions prematurely dying, millions being consigned to horrific levels of poverty, all unintended on his part, and much of which would have been at best difficult to have changed, given his departure and a replacement by the figure of Boris Yeltsin and the interests of this new corrupt Russian elite and of international capital that worked together to essentially pillage Russia.
So, Jeff, the article talks about how he became the most hated man or the most reviled man in Russia. And in thinking about that, he was kind of hated by everybody, wasn't he? Because he was hated by those who have crowded around Putin, who see Gorbachev as this weak, leader who allowed for all of this to happen and victimized by the West. He's also simultaneously hated by those with this extreme Soviet nostalgia for whom he represents the sort of polar opposite of that. And so in a sense he kind of is in no man's land historically, right? He's hated on both sides, as it were.
Yeah, yeah, and this is, sometimes I find this even in just personal interactions. I mean, sometimes, uh, you know, trying to make as many people happy as possible will, of course, earn you the most enemies. That's for sure. And sometimes it's not the way to go. Is to just try and make everyone happy. I think it's a good uh, inclination to have, but you can't always try and act on that. But in terms of his legacy, as I say at the end of my piece, all he was left with was a foundation, one which had marginal influence by the 1990s and by the 21st century was almost entirely neglected.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave it there. Jeff Sommers has been with me again. The article we've been talking about, it's really a great piece that we had on Counterpunch a couple of weeks ago. How Mikhail Gorbachev became the most reviled man in Russia. Again, Jeffrey Sommers. The book, I want you to all to get a copy of The Contradictions of Austerity, the Socioeconomic Costs of the Neoliberal Baltic Model. He's a professor of political economy and public policy in the Department of African and Diaspora Studies and senior fellow at the Institute of World Affairs, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Jeff is a regular counterpuncher, and we always love to talk to him. Hey, Jeff, thanks again for chatting with us.
Great being with you, Eric. Keep up the counterpunching.
Listeners, viewers, thank you as always, and we will chat again next time.